Um, Today I thought I would talk about the photographer and what actually is a photographer and who can be claimed to be called or be a photographer. It's a title I still use on all my websites, social media. I put at the top photographer because even though I do another job alongside this full time, I see myself predominantly as a photographer, and I always equate it to that film Happy Gilmore, where he's desperate to be a hockey player, and it turns out he's dog shit at hockey, but brilliant using a hockey stick to play golf and becomes a good golfer and wins golf. But he's still crap at hockey player, but he still sees himself as a hockey player. And I've always heard my wife laugh with that because I used to actually have that on my social media handle. I'm a hockey player because I see myself as a photographer because that's who I am, that's how I feel, that's how I got into the other job I also have through photography. So photography for me for the last 20 years has been the thing that's kind of cemented my whole being, and I see myself as a photographer. Plus I do still work, get commissions as a photographer, and I see myself as a photographer, and within that there are all caveat of other things which I bring into the party as a photographer, other things I've learned and done prior to that, but predominantly I see myself as a photographer. And I don't use tags like semi-professional because semi-professional means nothing. You're either a professional or you're not. And professional, particularly in the field of photography, is it's a misnomer. It doesn't mean anything other than you earn a few quid from it, really. But the tag professional gets tagged to photography all the time. And I always say, look, a doctor is a professional, but a doctor doesn't walk around going, "Oh, I'm a professional doctor." Or, a van driver is a professional van driver for a living, but doesn't walk around going, "I'm a professional van driver." Photographers, for some reason, I think it's because they think it makes them look good, like a proper photographer, when all it really does is make them look like a twat. So I try to avoid the professional tag as much as I can. But I thought over the years, what is a photographer? What actually is a photographer? How can somebody be called a photographer? What is it about photography that makes them a photographer? I mean, obviously, I'm a human being, but I class myself as a photographer, which is a bit daft, really, because I'm a human who does photography. But I was watching the latest episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. When would it have been? Early last week. And he was interviewing Julian Lennon, who is John Lennon's son, as many of us, or all of us will know. And I've followed Julian for a long time, mostly because I'm a fan of his dad. I'm a big Beatles and John Lennon fan. And it's always good to see what the kids are doing, how their lives have developed. And Julian's been one of those who's had a go at everything over the years. He's done music, he's done photography, he's done documentaries. He's quite a good humanitarian. He's one of the good guys, I think, really, is what I'm trying to say. So he's always had an interesting path for me to follow. But I didn't know he was on Joe Rogan, so I just came across it by chance, so I thought I'll watch this. And it was really interesting listening to him. Now, of course, I've followed his photography before. I've seen his photography. And my first reaction was a little bit like it all often is when I see people who are famous for doing other things suddenly stray into photography. I had a similar reaction when I discovered, what's his name? That really crap Canadian musician who my wife has a soft spot for. What's his bloody name? Brian Adams? Yeah, he suddenly became a photographer. So I looked at some of his work and it's all right. It's the kind of stuff that you see on internet forums where, part-timers do nice landscapes and seascapes and stuff. But there was nothing, wow. But because he's famous for being a musician, suddenly he's famous for being a photographer as well. And then another one that I stumbled across years ago was Ian Beale out of EastEnders. For non-UK viewers, EastEnders is a soap which has been running in the UK from the 80s, and the actor playing Ian Beale, Adam Woodyard, got into photography, and his work's interesting. There's a little bit of good stuff in there. Some of it's cliched, but he's a famous British actor. He's famous in Britain. Suddenly he's a photographer, so he must be a good photographer. There's kind of a bit of that to it. And then you see people like Michael Stipe from REM, who are now photographers, and a little bit of me thinks, well, it's great because it means more people are seeing photography, more people are getting into photography. It's got a wider audience. But at the same time, it pisses me off a little because I often think, hang on a minute, you've had your go at fame and fortune. You've had your big payday. You've had your worth as a musician or actor or whatever it is. Bugger off out of the photography sphere. There's enough of us here already trying to scrape a living without people like you coming along and getting your £1 million worth. So it does hurt me a little bit when that happens. Probably some of it is rooted in jealousy. But, I'm thinking, oh, fuck me. I've been at this 20 years, not achieved the level they have in one shoot because of who they are. It does piss me off. That it does make me think. And there'll be photographers out there who worked a lot harder than me over the last 1, 2, 3, 10, 15, 30, 50 years who will be thinking, well, fuck me, my work's better than his. Why aren't I getting that gig? And it does often come back to that old adage of it's not what you know, it's who you know. But it was interesting listening to Julian on this podcast because I was listening to his, talk about his work, which is quite interesting. And then at about, 1 minute 25, something like that, 1 minute, 1 hour 25 in, Joe says to him, so how did you, when you first started photography, how did you learn it? Did you take classes or? And he says, no, I have no idea what I'm doing, pretty much. So that made me go, huh? And I listened a little bit more. I listened a few times, and he says, I have no idea what I'm doing technically. And he goes on to say that I think, my kind of strength in photography is the aesthetics. I can see a shot, which is the thing I always say that is the most difficult thing to teach to students of photography. You can teach anybody all the tech stuff, but quite often they never get the thing they should be looking at. And I've spoke about it in other podcasts where I've talked about I spent too much time being technically good or trying to be technically good and ended up missing the shot because I was that busy faffing about with tech. So I guess Julian's never going to have that problem because he doesn't know how the camera works. And he goes on to say that he kind of relies on the camera, the auto settings, a good quality camera to get the picture because he hasn't got a clue what he's doing in that respect. And it led me to question that thing even further. And all right then, so if you look on his biographies anywhere, if you look even on Joe Rogan's podcast on YouTube, if you look on the credits, it says Julian Lennon's a Grammy-nominated singer-songwriter, photographer, author, filmmaker. And I thought, well, what then makes a photographer? What is a photographer? Why do I call myself a photographer? Why does Julian call himself a photographer? Why do people say Julian Lennon's a photographer? Why is Michael Stipe a photographer? And I thought, what is it about photography? What is it about that art form, that thing that makes you a photographer? So I thought I'd get into that a little bit today because I think fundamentally it pisses me off that people can come out of nowhere and suddenly be pronounced as profound photographers because they've made some nice pictures. So over the last few days I've been going through this and thinking about it, and I've been equating all sorts of jobs to this and that, and what does this mean, and what, I really kind of like driving myself a bit nuts trying to answer the question. And I got some, I think, answers myself, but it'd be interesting at the end to see you guys comment and feedback to me on what you think a photographer is. So I started thinking about other photographers I know, other photographers I've come across, other photographers' work I kind of like or dislike or I'm interested in, to see where the best photography was, and to see then how those photographers who made, in my opinion, the best photography approached it. And for me, I guess where I'm starting from is I'm saying to be a photographer, you have to understand how a camera works, why it works, what to do with that camera in that scenario before you've put it to your eye and took the picture, found the shot. And I think if you don't do that and can't do that, you can't possibly know what the shot's going to be. The shot is just an happen chance, and anybody can do that. I could hand my camera quite recently. I did a Christmas themed photo shoot for my nephews and nieces, and they wanted to go on the camera. Oh, Uncle Lance, can we ever go on your camera? I'm like, of course you can, come and sit there. So they come sat on my knee and they held the camera. I held it with them, but they got their hands on the camera. I showed them where the shutter button was, and I'm like, Are you ready? 3, 2, 1. And they were taking a picture and they loved it. And some of those pictures are actually quite good. But does that make them a photographer? They had no idea how it was set up, no idea why it was set up, no idea what the f-stop was doing, no idea what the ISO was doing, or the colour balance was doing, no idea where the focus was. They were just holding the camera taking a picture. And a nice picture. But it doesn't make them a photographer, does it? The photographer was me, who had done all that, set it up to get nice pictures, or to get the correct pictures. So I was thinking about this as I was mulling over what makes a photographer, what is a photographer. And just going back to Julian Lennon's interview again, he talks a little bit about equating it to his music as well. He's probably still more celebrated as a musician than a photographer, but he equates his music to being self-taught as well. He says he can't read or write music, he's self-taught as a musician. And I thought, well, is that the same thing? So I thought, I've had a similar experience. For 10 years or so in the 90s, I was a musician until I got some real bad ear damage and had to stop playing live, and I carried on for a few years, but I couldn't play live. It would hurt. It hurts now when I listen to anything of a certain pitch, or if somebody shouts too loud near me or blows a whistle, it makes me want to kill them, because I get the ear damage is so bad in my left ear. The pain is so intense I can't bear it. So I don't play live anymore, but I still have guitars around the house. I still record and write music sometimes. But when I started in the late 80s, I wasn't taught how to be a musician. I just wanted to be a musician. And if you look back at the Beatles in the day, couldn't read or write music originally. And I came from a background where I couldn't afford to have lessons or have all the latest stuff. And so I was scraping bits of guitars for birthdays, and I even rescued a guitar once off a house fire. It never stayed in tune, but it was a lovely looking guitar. It was like a bit like a Rickenbacker hollow body in Sunburst. And I rescued that and played that. But my dad taught me. My dad could play guitar. He learnt guitar in the 60s, and he taught me how to play the basics in guitar, the chords, and a few little House of the Rising Sun. That was the first one I learned to play. But I was self-taught. And Julian, says that he's self-taught. He probably taught himself from being around his dad and Ringo and John, all those other people, Paul and whatnot. So it's quite easy to pick music up, and photography can be picked up in the same way. I did a very similar thing in photography. When I got into photography, I was around other photographers quite a lot, and I was learning from them, watching, interesting, listening, seeing what things did. But what I did as a musician is I learnt how a guitar works, how an amplifier works, how a PA system works, how miking the PA up through the amp to the PA works, how mixing that works, how getting a soundscape works. I mean, literally, I could strip a guitar down to its bare bones now and tell you how it works, put it back together and make it work for you. I understand all that stuff because I felt to be the best musician I could be, the best guitarist I could be, the best singer-songwriter I could be. I needed to understand properly the thing I was playing. If you don't understand that the neck's not perfectly straight, or is it bowed in or bowed out, why is the action so bad on the fretboard? Why am I always out of tune? Why can I never get the action great from the first fret to the 22nd fret? All those things I learned and understood to make me a better guitarist and a better musician, singer-songwriter. And I then equate that through to photography. To be the best photographer I can be, I need to understand what that thing in my hand does, all its capabilities, all its limitations. And so every camera I've had or I've got, whether it's a digital camera or a film camera or the camera in my pocket on my phone, I stripped it down to basics, not literally, but learnt the basics. Why does it work? All right then. So